Hello, and welcome to the lecture for week 3 of my Philosophy of Mind course. This week we will be talking about sensation and perception. And this is a really interesting and exciting time to be discussing these kinds of issues because there's a lot of really exciting work that's being done right now. Currently, this is a center of renewed interest among contemporary philosophers. So this is going to be an introduction to the philosophy of sensation and perception. And like all of these things, you should take it, strictly speaking, as an introduction. We're going to cover a lot of material. And if you wanted to be serious about any of this, you would have to then go and take a complete and entire course on any individual topic that we'll brush past in this discussion. So feel free to ask questions and get involved. So starting from a common sense standpoint, we can say that the senses are what allow us to perceive the world that we are in. And immediately this brings up two questions. So on the one hand, we have a question about the senses. How many are there? How many could there be? How many kinds of senses are there? That's one question. And then there's another question about any given creature and the particular senses it happens to have. For instance, you might think vision is a kind of sense, but if you're born without eyes, you may not have that type of sense. You may have different particular senses. And so there's an interesting question about how we count the varieties of senses, and we'll talk about that in great detail in this lecture. On the other hand, we have the question about perception, which is, we say that we perceive things in the world and the properties of the world, but what exactly are the objects of perception? Which things in the world are we perceiving? And that's going to be the second half of this lecture. So roughly speaking, the plan then is to divide these as much as possible into these two categories. On the one hand, address the questions about how many senses, how many kinds, what kinds, and that sort of thing. And then on the other hand, address the question of, well, what are the objects of perceptions? Or is there something mental that we perceive, or do we somehow perceive the physical things themselves? Now, before we begin, though, trying to clarify these questions and make sense of them, I want to say that we're going to take the topic of consciousness, insofar as that's possible, and set it off to one side. So we're going to spend 2 weeks on the topic explicitly of consciousness. And so in week 4, we'll talk about general properties of consciousness, like subjectivity, and the popular phrase, what it's like for one, introduced by Thomas Nagel. We'll read that paper, What It's Like to Be a Bat. What is it like to be a bat? Question mark. And then we'll talk about some, varieties of concepts of consciousness. And then we'll turn to the next week, questions of whether perception is always conscious, unconscious perception. Can you have a consciousness that you don't know that you have? And all of those interesting questions, which are surrounding issues of perception and consciousness, are going to be put there. And there's going to be some other questions as well, like the relation of consciousness to thought and consciousness to concepts, and can they influence each other and such like that. So there are very interesting questions, but we're going to save those for the following 2 weeks. And in this section, we'll just focus on these two questions that we have above us. What do we perceive, and how many kinds of senses are there, or could there be? Okay, so starting with the first question there, you could start with the most obvious one, since, we'll start with humans and work our way outwards. So you might say, look, well, how many senses do human beings have? And so here I'm trying to ask a question about not any particular human being, but us as a species, as a kind of thing in the world. How many senses does the properly functioning average person have? That's one question. And interestingly enough, this question was really first explicitly addressed by Aristotle. And his claim was that there are 5 senses, and we know these 5. So vision is one of them. Hearing, or auditory sensation, what we call audition, that's also another one. Then there's smelling, or olfactory sensation, or olfaction. And then there is feeling, the sense of touch, which we call tactition, and that's where we get tactile from. And then there is the sense of taste or flavor, which we call gustation. So Aristotle's answer was that there are these five senses, and there are only these five senses in human beings. Now, these senses allow the animal to perceive the world that it's in. And according to Aristotle, having a perception or having a sensory organ and being capable of perception is what distinguishes animals from plants. So Aristotle denies that plants have anything like sensation or perception. Um, and that might be something that we'll look at later, the question of, is there anything like sensation or perception going on in plants? Aristotle would say no. So he would say, look, this is what makes us the way that we are. And of the five, it seems like he would have claimed that touch is the most basic and fundamental sense. And the reason why I say this is because he claims that it's the sense which every animal has, right? Even lowly creatures like sea slugs and so forth have the capability of sensing their environment by contact. So that's an interesting claim that he makes, that you have to have some kind of sense organ as well as be capable of perception, and that every animal, every kind of animal, not every particular individual animal, but every kind of animal is exactly an animal because of having this ability. Okay, so now if you wanted to know how many kinds of senses that there are, Aristotle gives you an answer. He says, well, what we call a kind of sense is individuated, or spliced off from the other ones by the kind of property in the world that it allows us to be responsive to. So the idea is that there are these various properties in the world, and the sense organs are the things which allow us to be responsive to these properties, and that's what allows us to perceive these things in the world. So that each sense is going to deal with a certain kind of thing out there, according to Aristotle. Now, he further distinguishes what he calls the common sensibles from proper sensibles. And to start with common sensibles first, what he means by saying that something is a common sensible is that it's the type of property which is detectable or sensible by more than one sense organ. And so one obvious example here is shape. You can see the shape that an object has, and you can also go and touch it, and you can therefore feel what the shape of an object is. There's an interesting question about the relationship between the two of them that we'll come back to. But for now, we can just point out that these properties, this property, the property of shape, seems like it's sensible in more than one way. It's not accessible in only one particular manner. Now, Aristotle says it turns out that there are a number of properties in the world that are commonly sensible like this, and he points to things like motion. You can see something moving, but you can also feel it. Like if you're sitting, you experience acceleration. So that seems to be something that's detectable by multiple avenues. And he also points to magnitude, which is how big or how heavy something is, and then number and unity. So these were, according to Aristotle, things which we could sense via more than one of our five senses. But each sense, though, even though some properties are commonly sensible, each sense is associated, according to Aristotle, with a limited range of properties which it's sort of specially suited or especially responsive to. So, for instance, in the case of vision, we have a sense organ, namely the eye, right? So the eye is what allows us to sense the visual properties, and the things which we thereby come to perceive, this way, the proper sensible, at least, vision is color. So that according to Aristotle, when you're perceiving color, it involves something to do with the eyes, and then that somehow creates, or we'll talk more about what this means exactly in a more general way in a second, but you're in contact with the property of color. And for each sense, then there's something like this. So for instance, in hearing, you have a sense organ, namely the ear, and that sense organ is detecting or somehow sensitive to a certain property, which makes it the kind of thing that it is, and that particular property is sound. So according to Aristotle, you are perceiving sounds by using the sense organ, the ear. Right? This is, I hope so far, fairly commonsensical. This is why it's lasted for so long. Okay, and then so on for smelling. You have, again, a sense organ, the nostrils, the nose, and you are, the proper sensible here is odor, the smell. And then the same for taste or gustation. The proper sensible here, according to Aristotle, is flavor. So these four have one and only one proper sensible, which according to Aristotle means, for instance, that while vision uses the eye to detect or somehow let you perceive colors, that you cannot perceive color by smell, and you cannot perceive color by sound, and you cannot perceive color by taste, because that's not the kind of property that is revealed to you in those other ways, according to Aristotle. Now, of course, I hope you see where this is going. Almost every one of these claims is going to be challenged at some point, and a lot of what the philosophy of sensation and perception is sort of trying to figure out, to a large extent, whether Aristotle and common sense, which he symbolizes here, has got things correctly. Okay, so I've been saving the last one here because it's the most complicated on this view, and that's the feeling, the sensation of touch, which according to Aristotle we use, our hands and skin. That's the exterior of us is where the organ of that is located, and there's not a single proper sensible according to Aristotle here. So there's no one single aspect or property of the world that touch gets us in contact with, but rather there's multiple of them. And so Aristotle says, look, there's a lot of them, and he sort of lists all of them, and we're not going to bother about this because this isn't a class on Aristotle's views. This is just sort of, I'm taking Aristotle to be a stand-in for the common sense view here. And so after going through this, he says, look, we can basically see that all of these are somehow reducible to a basic set. So with touch, you can tell whether something has a property of being dry, a solid, right, by touching it. You can tell if something is a liquid, or if it's fluid by touching it. And you can also detect heat, and you can also detect cold. So Aristotle says, well, a lot of the other things that we sense by touch are really combinations of these in various varieties, and we'll kind of leave that there. Okay, so that's in very much large extent the traditional view about the senses and the way they relate to perception. So on this very traditional view, the senses always involve the use of an organ in order to allow the creature to perceive some aspect or property that the world has. Okay, so we're going to talk about whether this view is right in multiple ways. So the first thing we'll talk about is whether humans only have 5 senses. So one thing, and all of this stuff right here comes from an article by Fiona McPherson, who's done some really excellent work on this, and she has a really excellent anthology on the philosophy of the senses. One thing that we notice right off the bat is, well, if you look at fiction, it's just replete with examples of possible other kinds of senses. So just take one example, X-ray vision, the Superman variety. That seems like a special kind of sense, which humans don't have, but I don't know, it seems possible. Mind reading, another very traditional kind of sense, you might think, the ability to sense other people's thoughts, and that's always something popping up in fiction. Then there's the ever popular so-called sixth sense, the ability to perceive ghosts or to see into the future or something like that. Now remember, I'm not claiming that any of these are in fact real. What I'm saying is that in some sense or other, pun sadly intended, in some sense or other, these things have at one time or other been thought to be possible senses that human beings could have, even if they don't in fact have. And then we can add to this some more science fiction-y examples, like the Predator infrared kind of vision, if you remember the movie The Predator, and of course if you've seen the movie The Terminators. Now, if you sort of just forget for a second that the Terminator is a machine and ignore the question of whether machines can have perception, something we'll talk about towards the end of this class, but for right now, just ignore it. And just imagine the kind of perception that the Terminator is depicted as having. So he's able to look at an object and determine its composition chemically, and that sort of information is available in perception, you might think, in the way that the movie is depicted to us. And then, of course, there's also another one from fiction here, which is the spider sense. And this whole list comes from McPherson's introduction to her anthology. So now, what is the point of this list? Well, I'm not saying that these are real, like I've said already. What I've said is, well, there doesn't seem anything absurd or impossible or anti-common sense about the idea that there are more than five senses. In fact, it seems like people are always coming up with ways that we could possibly have more than five senses. So then the real question is, are there real examples of extra senses besides the standard so-called traditional five senses? So to begin with, we can talk about things like senses of humor, sense of justice, sense of fairness, or what is sometimes called the moral sense. You might ask yourself, well, I don't know, is there such a thing as a sense of humor? Is that really a sense? Is there an organ, some faculty that we have, which is dedicated to picking out properties of being funny, being not funny? Well, many people sort of go, well, nah, no. That's a sort of metaphorical use of the word sense, although, there might be some people who could defend this kind of view. Now, the moral sense, there are actual people in the history of the world who have said there is such a faculty that works like a sense, where it allows you to pick up on certain properties of the world, like being right or being wrong, being good or being bad, being just or being fair. And some of these people, if you look at, take an ethics class, you'll talk about them. And that's highly debatable whether this counts as a sense. But some people might say, look, what the emotions are, or something like an emotional faculty looks like it might be responsive to these kinds of properties. Like there might be a kind of feeling, emotional feeling one gets when one sees injustice, and that might be the source of our perception of injustice. So we'll leave that question aside, but it is an interesting question, and it's one that we're going to come back to when we get to the stuff about thought and so forth, because you might wonder, can you really perceive injustice? Is that the type of thing is that the type of property which could even count as a perceptible property? So let's table that for a second and look at some other kinds of examples. Now, traditionally, what people do is they appeal to some current empirical findings. So one of the most easiest places to start here, and one of the most widely discussed possible other kinds of senses, is what's called proprioception. So this, in just normal terms, is the ability of you to know where your body is in space and what it's doing in a kind of immediate and direct way. So, a way to get a feel for this is if you close your eyes and stretch out your arm, think about the way that feels. So just be quiet for a second and focus on that. If someone were to ask you, is your arm stretched out or not, you'd be able to answer them without looking, without touching yourself, without hearing anything, without smelling something. So what allows you to know how your arm is extended or not? Are you making a fist? Is your finger pointed out? Is it in a crooked position? Well, if you make these various movements and pay attention to your experience, you might notice, oh, we're very good at telling where our body is in space. So some people say, look, and and in fact, the reason is there are these nice little receptors located in the muscles, and these give us this information. So it looks like there's all the there's a kind of sensory organ there. There's a kind of perceptual thing that we're getting in contact with, where our body is in space. So that's one candidate, proprioception. And there are some other ones which are similar to this. So the other one is that you hear a lot about is the vestibular sense. And this has to do with your sense of balance. So we know that this has to do with stuff in the inner ear, and there's a little liquid-filled cavity there. And if you tilt your head, the liquid is turning back and forth. And so therefore that's used to determine whether you're upright, upside down, tilted in a certain direction or whatnot. We're very sensitive to these kinds of changes. So some people say, well, maybe what you're doing is you're sensing your orientation as your balance. Very interesting idea. Here's another one. Is there a vomeronasal sense, where this is getting at the idea, is it somehow possible that we're sensitive to pheromones? Now in animals, this is less controversial. Like dogs, we know they have this kind of sensitivity to pheromones. And it's a lot more controversial whether humans do. And we're not here to settle that debate. We're just here to sort of point out that some people have said, well, okay, this is a possibility for an extra sense, one that's we're not quite aware of, or if we are aware of it, we haven't been able to pick it out of our experience yet. So this is a controversial one. And let me just mention one last candidate here, really briefly. And this has to do with with touch. So what scientists have discovered, what science has shown us, is that if you really go into the detail of what's happening at the skin level, you find out that there isn't just one kind of receptor down there, but that there are, it looks like, 3 different broad kinds of receptors that look like they're receptive to different things. So on the one hand, we have a receptor which seems like it's activated by temperature, hot and cold, heat. On the other hand, we have receptors that deal with pain and itch, as it turns out. And then on the other hand, we have receptors that just can detect whether you're being compressed or not, like how much pressure you're applying. And that's important, of course, so that when you go to reach for a nice thin glass of champagne, you don't crush it in your grip. You know just how much pressure to apply. And you're also, so that these all 3 things then, generally we would classify under the experience of touch. And so some people have said, well, look, maybe there isn't a unified thing here. Maybe there isn't one sense, the sense of touch. Maybe there are 3 different senses: the sense of temperature, the sense of pain, and the sense of pressure. And then if that were the case, there wouldn't be 5 senses, but rather these 7, because you'd have to split this last one up into 2 extra categories to account for the different kinds of receptors. Now, we're not going to answer these questions here. Remember, we're bringing them up to discuss them. What do we think? But the questions here force us to be serious about what we mean by a sense. What does it mean to call something a sense? How do we say whether or not these things count as other senses, or whether touch counts as one unified sensation, or whether there are these 3 different ones? And there are various answers that people give, and we can talk about those various answers. But before we do, just to complicate things here, here's a nice quote again from Fiona McPherson. She says, quote, "Other candidates that have been considered as being additional human senses include hunger, thirst, wet and dry, the weight of objects, fullness of bladder, and also bowels, I would suppose, suffocation and respiration, like whether you're breathing or being deprived of oxygen, sexual appetite, when you're feeling sexually aroused, and lasciferousness, which I don't know if I pronounced that right, but that's generally the feeling of lactating, and that these all have been proposed as other kinds of senses. So again, these questions difficult to answer. Is the sense of thirst a distinct sense? Well, there's something, according to brain science, that is causing this. That's namely, saline levels in your blood serum. So you're sensitive to that at some level. And when they reach below, when the saline content is too much or something like that, you come to be aware of that via having the experience of thirst. And so some people say, well, look, why doesn't that count as a sense? And if you think it does, well, then you might say, well, gee, there's just a bunch of senses. We can be pluralist about this. And if you think it doesn't, then it'd be interesting to hear why you don't think this is a sense. So again, remember, I'm not trying to convince you of anything here. I'm trying to say, well, gee, there look like a lot of candidates here. And if you disagree with these being good candidates, then let's discuss why. Okay, so then moving on, though, to a different question, we can talk about cross-modal effects. So now we're going to be looking at sort of a different aspect of Aristotle's view. On Aristotle's view, these five senses, which now we've already started to question, do humans have more? But you take the basic five, Aristotle claimed not only are they discrete, in other words, that they have a proper sensible that no other sense can detect, but they don't interact. So vision produces just color experiences, audition produces just sound experiences, and there is no separate, combined audio-visual experience. There's just the auditory one and the visual one, but there is no audio-visual one, somehow one that's combined or fused. So this is what's called multimodal contents, and that's because the different modes here are being combined. The mode of sensing by vision, the mode of sensing by hearing. So that's where the modal talk comes from. So one thing that people talk about here is something called the McGurk effect. And I don't have a video to show you, but you could Google it and look at it. And it's going to be sort of hard to explain. I'm now realizing I should have had a slide here spelling out the different sounds, because it can be quite confusing just listening to it. And in fact, maybe I'll go back over in the captions to actually put them here. But the basic idea is this. So if you take a subject and you sit them down and you have them watch a video of a person saying a word. So the trick is, or excuse me, and it's not even a word, it's a phoneme. So they're just making a sound. And the sound that is actually being said and which the subject hears is ba, ba, which we would spell as B-A. Ba, B-A, ba, B-A. So you get the idea. But the video which the sound is paired with and which the person is watching shows a video of that same person but saying a different phoneme. So they're not saying B-A, ba. They're saying ga, G-A, ga. So they're sitting there and they're watching a person. They're going, ga, that they're making that mouth move, and they're hearing the person say, ba. So that's confusing, right? We have the B-A and we have the G-A. Now, so what do you think that the person who's watching the video, what do they experience? Well, what they report, and you can go and watch this for yourself and determine whether you agree or not, but it's very robust finding. What they report is that they experience the sound da, D-A, da, D-A. So now that's very interesting. What's going on here? They're hearing the actual sounds. The actual sounds that they're hearing are the sounds ba, B-A. The lips that they're watching are forming with their lips the phoneme G-A, ga. But yet the ultimate experience of those two presented together from the subject's point of view is the sound D-A, da. Now, the question arises is, what's going on here? Is this somehow where you have one kind of content, the auditory content, and it has the content that it does, and then you have the visual content, and they kind of battle, and then somehow the auditory content gets changed, and now it has this new content, ga. So that there's this interaction between the two senses, and the one sense kind of modifies the other, so it changes the way that it works. Or is it that there's a new kind of perceptual content which is produced, which is neither purely visual or purely audio, but is somehow a combined multimodal audio-visual da thing? It can be very hard to know what the right answer is here. Okay, so that's a very abstract question. Are these things, do they influence each other, or do they combine to form some new thing, some further thing which is different in important respect from either of the two other things? So the question is, do you have two things that interact, and so at the end you just have one of those two things that's changed? Or do you have two things interact, producing a third thing, so that at the end you have three things instead of two? That's roughly one way of thinking about this. And here's another example of this. And this is brought out by what in perceptual science is sometimes contrasted between taste and flavor. So remember, Aristotle thought that flavor was the proper sensible of gustation, of our sense of taste. And flavor was this proper thing. Now, one thing that we've discovered is that, well, it seems like the sense of smell is importantly involved in which flavors we experience. So if you have a cold and you eat your favorite food, your nose is stopped up really bad, the food tastes different. And you can just try that, plug your nose and eat something and experience it without the nose plugged, and it seems different. So some people think, well, you see, flavor is somehow not really the product of taste, but it's the combination of taste and smell. And taste really is the thing that you're doing with your mouth and your tongue. And then there's this smelling bit as well, and the two together are, we kind of confuse as one thing, and we call that flavor. So there's really two things there, some people claim. Now, of course, other people claim, well, no, the flavor might be this new third thing, which is a combination of the taste and the smell, and they combine into a new multimodal taste smell. So again, we have the same question. What is going on here? Is there an interaction between these two things? Like, is there a taste and a smell, and they simply push and pull in a certain way and change each other? Or is there a new thing that's produced? Kind of like, like when you have a child, you interact with another person in a certain way, let's say, and then, out comes a third new thing, which is kind of a combination of you two, but importantly also distinct and different. So is there a new thing which is produced, this multimodal content, which is somehow not the product of any one sense, but is a product of the fusing of multiple senses? That's the question that is being addressed here, and we don't know the answer. This is something that is currently under discussion. And so again, feel free to jump into the discussion. I'd like to hear what you think. Okay, so really quickly then, we can bring up two other kinds of interesting challenges. So one is the issue of synesthesia, which is a complicated issue. And one of the reasons that it's complicated is that it's people are currently it's currently in such a state of discovery, you might say, that we're still debating exactly how you define it. So synesthesia, one common report that synesthetes make is that when they see a number, for instance, they also experience a color. Sometimes people say no, they associate a personality with a number, like a 7 is a real nice person, an 8 is a kind of hard ass, a 9 is a sneaky underhand. Like they'll say stuff like that. Other people say, oh, what 4 is, I always see it as blue, or there's a blueness there, or 7 is red. I mean, I'm making these exact colors up, but people will say these things that there's a kind of another property which we usually associate with a different sense, which is produced in this weird way. Sometimes, read a word and a smell is produced, or these various what seems to be linkages between the senses. And one of the challenges that synesthesia presents is how we handle it from a philosophical perspective when we're trying to individuate the kinds of senses that there are. So if you think there are these weird kinds of interactions, and so if you want to say, aha, well, what about take an example of someone who hears a sound and also experiences the sound as colored. So they might say, yeah, the sound has a certain color. Well, how can they experience the color associated with the sound if Aristotle's right, and you only sense sounds by hearing? One way you might put this is that the person is hearing a color. But does that even make sense to say that the person is hearing a color or seeing a sound? These are very strange ways of putting things, but if the person is having in a visual experience, and in that somehow a sound is importantly involved, not as coming from the ear, but somehow as being involved in the sight, then we don't know what to say. And so we're still trying to figure out what the best way to make sense of synesthesia is. And then finally, before we move on from this topic, we've got to mention sensory substitution, which is a very interesting phenomenon. And I remember first hearing about this work as an undergraduate. I happened to take a class on the philosophy of mind. And in that class, there was a student who reported to the class that the work of his uncle was doing this weird stuff. And it turns out that the student was related to Paul Bach-y-Rita, and that he was at the very early stages of doing his tactile visual sensory substitution work. And so this has now been around for a while and is getting some more broad attention. But it's an extremely fascinating body of work, which we are not going to be able to do justice to in the next few minutes that we spend discussing it. But we can at least bring it up and point to the interesting challenges that it raises. So Bach-y-Rita wanted to try to figure out a way to help blind people see their environment or navigate the environment using visual information in some way. And he thought, well, if you get some people who, their visual cortex is relatively intact, but they just have some kind of problem with the eye, then if only there was some way that you could get a camera and get the information that the camera is able to capture, like a video camera, and somehow allow the person to use that information. I mean, ideally you would like to hook the camera into the input that the eyes were giving the brain, but that can't be done. So he said, well, how else can we do this? And one very interesting idea that he came up with is that you might be able to do it substituting the sense of touch as a channel for the information. So the way that you do this is you make something that taps, literally it's a little bar that taps like a telegraph machine, so that it goes tap, 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 tap. And one very simple way to illustrate this is that you could have this thing tap, you hook it up to a camera, and the speed at which it taps might vary with, how far an object is. So let's say an object is 5 feet away, it might tap once every fifth of a second or something like that. And if the object were getting closer, it might speed up and tap more quickly. And if it got really quick, so you could see that this thing would do that. And then what's interesting is you take this, you hook it up to a camera, and then you put a device on a person so that they can feel this tapping. And usually they have an array of these little tappers so that there's a group of them, and there can be a whole bunch of them. So you can get complex tapping patterns, so you can get different levels of information being related. And what's interesting is these people, they say at first that they just feel tapping. But eventually, as they wear this device and get used to using it, eventually the tapping goes away, they say, and they come to be able to judge how far away things are. And they've been able to show that these people can hit baseballs. They can, like, you put something in their environment, they're able to reach out to it and grab it. So, and they also describe that it's kind of like a visual experience, that they have sensations of motion, that they can kind of have this sense of movement. And of course, it's nothing like the visual experience that we have. But the amazing thing here is that visual information and visual experiences, to some extent, are being created using purely tactile sensory input. So this kind of challenges, some people think, this challenges the idea that that vision only occurs by the eyes, or in other words, that there's an organ that vision occurs through. And some people say, no, look, it's not the eye that sees, it's the brain that's doing the seeing. The brain needs the information. You get it to it from any channel, right? You could get it in through the auditory channel, get it in through tapping. The brain's going to use that to see and generate visual experience. So some people will say, okay, so the whole idea that you have to have a specific sense organ, which is only able to pick up a certain kind of property, which then therefore is only able to be perceived in that way, is challenged by these kinds of sensory substitution cases. Now, of course, there are people who deny that. The point is that there's some interesting questions here which aren't resolved. And this technology, is getting better, but it's still in its beginning stages. And I encourage you to go on YouTube and to look at some of these. They have videos of people using these machines to navigate. And recently in Scotland, they had a big conference on this, and they had researchers put on some of these devices and try to actually feel around and see what it felt like. So this is very new, exciting stuff, and it's challenging our traditional conceptions of what it means to have a sense, to be sensing, or to be related to perceptible properties. Very interesting stuff. Okay, so all of that was just about humans. How many senses do humans have? And you might think, well, gee, what about the rest of the world? How many senses are there at all? Now, Aristotle would have said that all animals have these 5 basic senses in some combination or other. But what we have discovered is that there are other kinds of senses that animals have. And one of the most interesting is that there are certain kinds of animals that have an electromagnetism sense. And there are kind of 2 variations on this that's very interesting. So one is you find certain kinds of fish that have receptors that are sensitive to magnetic fields. And so that's what's called passive reception. They just have this receptor, and that tells them when they're in a magnetic field, and they can use that kind of information, the sense properties of the field. But then there's another variation on that, which is when these animals produce their own magnetic field and use that as a way to tell where, like, north is, or to navigate in their local environment. So that's very interesting. There does seem to be more senses in nature than merely the ones that we're capable of having. And in fact, it turns out that infrared perception is not science fiction, although maybe it is in the way the Predator depicts it. But snakes at least have infrared perception, and we know that there are other kinds of senses out there. Now, once you have this in mind, one natural question emerges, which is, well, gee, if there are these other senses that animals have, like for instance the electromagnetic sense, well, can I have that sense? I want it. I want to experience what it's like to sense an electromagnetic field. Is that possible, or is that not possible? Well, some people think it is possible that we are able to extend our sensory capacities in this way. And there are some people who will have a small magnet implanted underneath their skin. And the magnet will cause a kind of vibrating or sensation whenever one is in a magnetic field. And so people are then sensitive to a magnetic field in their environment. And you can, go online and people will talk about this and talk about what it's like for them. And so you might say, well, look, okay, is that like the tapping? Are you now coming? So it might be, you're picking up on pressure or vibration or something in your finger, but eventually they say they just don't even feel that anymore and they just are sensing the magnetic field. Is that what's going on here? If so, we could extend our sensory capabilities maybe. Can we hook up infrared lenses to our eyes? If we implant infrared goggles, does that extend our senses to include infrared? These are interesting questions which we're just beginning to grapple with. Now, here's where this question gets super interesting, because there are some people, and there's a group of transhumanists who started a company called Grindhouse Wetware, and involved in that is a guy named Tim Cannon. And Tim Cannon has a very interesting and bizarre idea. So one of his ideas is that if you could connect a tiny microchip to the magnet implanted in your skin, and if the microchip were connected to the internet and could transmit wirelessly, then you could have it track any kind of data you want, basically, and in a sense come to become sensitive to that kind of data. So what does that mean? Here's a quick example. Suppose you had this setup, magnets implanted. Suppose you have the microchip. The microchip is connected to the US crime database. So when you're walking around, the magnet is sort of using GPS, and the microchip is using GPS to know where you are. And it's tracking the crime statistics in the neighborhood you're in. And let's say you're getting a buzz, a vibration, an electrical pulse every time this information increases or decreases. So if you go into a neighborhood with a high crime rate, you might get a buzzing, buzz, 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 buzz. And if you're in a neighborhood where there's a low crime rate and not a lot of crimes are reported, you might almost have no buzzing. So are you then becoming sensitive to crime rates? Are you perceiving the crime rate in an area through this buzzing technique? Well, Tim Cannon says, yeah. He says, yeah, that's right. Now you've extended your perception to include perception of things like crime rate. He thinks that this will be good for society, because if you're walking around in a certain neighborhood, if it looks run down and you're not getting a buzz, you'll feel confident. Well, I'm not going to be scared just because this person in a hoodie's walking by me. There's low crime rate in this area. I'm not getting a buzz. So, of course, you walk into a neighborhood and you're getting a high buzz and you see someone in a hoodie, you might react differently. So this is a way of connecting us to other kinds of properties, or so says Tim Cannon. So I think it's an interesting question whether you count as perceiving these kinds of properties in this way. And this is obviously related to the question we're going to come back to in the next week and the week after that, which is how high level up can you go property-wise and still count as doing perception rather than thinking? So some people think, look, you might be able to perceive colors and shapes and sounds, and it's a question about whether they fuse together or stay separate, and that's all very interesting. But once you go up to things like crime and so forth and so on, you're in the realm of concepts, and that's not perception anymore, that's something else. So we're going to look at that, but here I'm kind of just flagging it in a more abstract kind of way. We're going to talk in the next section about whether you can perceive, elm trees as opposed to merely a certain arrangement of shapes, which you then use to infer that it's an elm tree. So we're going to come back to those kinds of questions when we discuss the relation between thought, concepts, and perception under the rubric of consciousness or category of consciousness. Okay, so we're almost done talking about the senses, but all of this brings up a very interesting question, which I think Fiona McPherson does a really good job of highlighting. And I think that this problem hasn't really been discussed as much as it should be. So I want to end this half of the lecture focusing on it. So think about bats. We know what bats do, right? Everyone talks about bats. They emit high-pitched chirping noises, and those sounds bounce off their environment, and they use that information to navigate their environment, right? They use that sonar, we say. So how do we describe this case? Is it the case that these bats have a extra and unique sense, like the electromagnetic sense, magnetic sense? They have this new interesting sense called echolocation? Or do they have the same sense that we have, the sense of hearing? It's just that their hearing is really good. Like the way that we talk about dogs. Dogs have smell, we say. It's the same sense as ours. Their noses are weird. Their noses are on the outside. Ours go in, but whatever. It's still smell, we say. It's just that they have a really good smell. So is it like that with bats? They just have a really good sense of hearing, but not a fundamentally new or different kind of sense like the electromagnetic sense? Or do we say, no, they have a weird kind of vision that they see with their ears, maybe like the way the sensory substitution people see with tactile stimulation on their sides. So which of these three ways do we go? There's a question. Now, of course, this is going to where we start with next week, and it's nice to bring up the bat case here because Nagel's article, "What is it like to be a bat?" Sort of drives this home. How do we describe what's going on in the bat? We can describe a lot of the physiology, but what is it like for the bat? Is it like having this new sense that we've never had before, such that if we had it, we'd be bewildered and confused? Or is it like having a really good sense of hearing, like that you can hear where the objects are? Or is it like having a really weird kind of vision where you kind of see in sounds or something like that, but that's still producing visual experiences? Well, how we answer that question brings us face to face with some of the most fundamental questions about subjectivity and consciousness and our relation to it, how we know about consciousness. So I want to bring that up and kind of go, okay, wait till next week and we'll get crazy about bats. Bat mania for next week. Okay, so on this same theme, I want to bring up two of these other kinds of issues. Again, this is from the Fiona McPherson paper. So the two interesting cases are the case of bees and their ultraviolet sense and snakes and their infrared sense. So bees are very interesting, and one thing we've learned is that they're sensitive to light in the ultraviolet range, so we're not sensitive to that. And the other thing that we've learned is that this is very useful for bees because it allows them to see where the nectar is in the flower, so that when they're flying around, they can kind of see the nectar. But we can't, right? Because the outside of the flower blocks us. We don't see ultraviolet. So now what do we say? Again, it's a similar kind of question that we just asked. What do we say about what's going on here? Is the bees' ultraviolet business kind of like vision, but just they see more? Or is it in a new weird sense, the ultraviolet sense? I mean, in one way, they're reacting to the same thing. It's light. It's just the light that we can't see. So how do we say whether it's a new kind of sense or a fancy or different version of one that we already have? And the same is true with the snakes. They have a receptor that allows them to detect in infrared heat and so forth. Is that like infrared vision, or is it some new infrared sense which doesn't deliver a visual kind of experience? So part of the problem here is that one way that we individuate the senses is via what it's like to have the experiences. And it's not, I mean, in addition to the physiology and also anatomy kinds of issues, as well as the kinds of properties that are out there. And this, I think, is what's nice about McPherson's paper, is that she ends up concluding, look, it's a lot of these different things that seem to matter to us when we're talking about what makes a sense a sense. And these kinds of considerations show us that, well, you're going to have to do a lot of work if you want to keep it to only 5. And if you want to say that these other ones are somehow versions of that. So for instance, in the snake again, what do you say? It has infrared vision or this new extra sense? Okay, so we've already talked about this visual substitution stuff, but again, there's a question about how you individuate the sense of vision and whether this throws a monkey wrench in it. All right, so that concludes the first half of the lecture, which I think really takes up more than half of the time that we'll be spending here. But the philosophy of sensation, I think, is very interesting. It's gotten kind of short shrift, and people have talked about perception a lot, but there's a renewed interest in the senses, and I happen to be one of the people who likes that renewed interest, so that's why I'm spending some time on it. Okay, so now we'll turn to some of the more traditional questions in the philosophy of perception. And these more traditional questions have tended to revolve around the issue of whether perceptions have content like intentional states do, or whether they don't have content. So one of these way of putting this is the question, are they representational? Are perceptions representational in the way that thoughts are? In other words, do they present the world to us in a certain way, or do they do something different? And here's a different way of asking that very same question. In perception, are we directly in contact with physical objects? Or do we ever perceive physical objects? So some philosophers have claimed that we never perceive physical objects, and that everything we perceive is mental, and that's idealism, the idea that nothing is physical and that everything is mental. And of course, we're going to have a whole section on questions about physicalism, idealism, and those dualism and those various views. So we're going to be putting off those kinds of issues. We'll be phrasing our question in terms of whether we directly or indirectly perceive physical objects. And you might say, well, look, I thought we were putting aside the question of whether there are physical objects out there. And so fair enough. Here's the way that we can formulate the question. In perception, are we in contact in the first instance with something that's mental or with something that isn't mental? Now notice that the common sense view is, well, no, it's not something mental. It's something in the world. When you see the table has certain properties, and that's not a mental thing. Right? That's idealism, that the table is a mental thing. So many people have thought, no, we have some kind of direct relationship to the physical world. The traditional problem, is that we seem to be forced towards something which some people have called the veil of perception. And we're going to go through this stuff in a lot of detail right now, but just to give you the flavor of this, the basic idea would be that there is something which stands in between us and the true reality as it is outside of perception, like a veil over your eyes. So the basic idea here is that when you look at the world, there's something in between you and the world, and that thing is called the mental perception, the representation of the world, which is, in the early days at least, likened to a picture, that you're watching like an image, or like you're sitting inside of a theater watching a film, and that film is called your experience and your perceptions and your sensations and your thoughts, and all of that is going on in a mental realm, which, if there is a physical world at all, is somehow outside of, and what you perceive only indirectly. So that's the basic idea. Now that's all very vague, but this problem's been around for a while, so maybe you're familiar with it at least to some extent. But let's try to put more of a finer point on this. So often you find people espousing a view called direct realism, also sometimes called naive realism, and really which it's called usually depends on whether the person you're talking to likes it or doesn't like it. You can see which one I think is which, hopefully. So direct realism, here's one, and people use these terms different ways. Again, I'm not going to be bogged down about word usage, but here's one way to use the words. So a direct realist is someone who thinks that when you look at the table and you see it as having a certain shape and certain colors and so forth, that it really is that way. That perception directly acquaints you or involves the objects and their properties. And one way you can know what they mean is that, yes, even when you aren't looking at it, it's that way. So to give an example here, suppose you're looking at a red apple and it's good light and you're not confused or anything. You're looking right at the red apple. And you might say, aha, see, I see the apple and its properties, that is red and round, spherical. And if I were to set it on a table and look away from it for a moment and ask myself, well, is it still there? Common sense, I would say, yeah, the apple's still there. Is it still a sphere or having that shape that I perceive that it's having? I'd say common sense is, yeah, it's, of course, it still has that shape. And direct realists say, and also it's still red, even when you're not looking at it. So it just is that way. And then when you look at it, it's just like, moving a window to reveal the thing that's there. So another way I like to put this sometimes is that these properties are mind independent, so that even if the apple were in a completely dark room, in a pitch black room with no light at all, no people around at all, the apple would still have all of these properties according to the direct realist. It would still be red. It'd be red in exactly the same way. It would still be spherical. It'd be spherical in exactly the same way. It'd still be an apple. It'd be an apple exactly the same way. The entirety of the thing that you contact in your experience is indifferent to you, or whether you're paying attention to it or perceiving it or interacting with it in any way. And of course, that's very different than your thought about the apple. Like if you think red apples are more delicious than green apples, many people are not tempted by the idea that that thought exists even, on a table when you're not having it, when you're not thinking. People will say, well, that's a mental thing. You see a thought, it only exists when you're thinking. So this is a traditional view, and you've noticed that we sort of been assuming something like it, and it's easy to talk that way. Aristotle definitely has this view. He is a direct realist. He thinks, what could be more obvious than that when you look at the apple has a certain property, the property of being red, and that when you experience it, that's just you becoming aware of the redness. You're not, creating it in the way you create your thought. Red is a color which is different from green. That's something that you create. The thought depends on you. Okay, so now why, besides common sense, what reason would you think that this is true? And one thing that many people appeal to here is something called the transparency of experience. And this is going to play an important role in our discussion in the next couple of weeks. When we talk about consciousness, because people appeal to this idea a lot there. So what does it mean to say that experience is transparent in this way? Well, again, think about the apple. You're looking right at the apple. You can see it. It's good light. You're awake. And Descartes says, well, maybe this is a dream and you're not awake. So maybe this is a computer simulation and you're in the matrix. You don't know that. You may have your reasons for believing that that's false, and we'll talk about some of those reasons later. But one thing that doesn't seem doubtable, or that you have any difficulty in knowing, is that the apple is red and that it appears to you in a certain way. Now, if someone said, okay, so there's the apple and you see that it's red. Now, where's the experience of the apple and it being red? Well, if you looking at the apple and you say, okay, so here's an apple. Now, where's the experience of the apple? It's hard to do much more than simply sort of point at the apple, the thing. So some people say, look, we don't experience the experience itself. We have an experience of the object, that it's kind of direct in this way. We directly experience the object, not an experience of the experience. And what's interesting is that this version of direct realism, what's sometimes called representationalism, and we'll talk about it in the next couple of weeks when we get to theories of consciousness. It's a way of saying, well, there's something mental involved, a representation of the object, but it's what the object represents that you are in contact with. And so there's a relationship between it and you, and that's the thing that you are aware of, not the experience itself. The experience itself is not something that you seem to experience. So, I mean, this just puts a kind of formal face on what we've been saying, namely that commonsensically, it doesn't seem like there's something in between you and the world. It's not the case in our day-to-day life that we feel as though, I'm tripping around this thing called my experience, trying to get at this other stuff called the physical world. So transparency is just a way of putting a name on that. It just looks like experience goes directly to the world. There's nothing like I go, where is it? There's the experience. What's behind it? Okay, so that's the basic idea behind the common sense view, and that view has come under attack. And the attack really begins with Descartes, and it goes through Descartes and Locke and Berkeley and Kant, and that traditional modern philosophy is associated with developing a version of this argument, and which gives you developed perception and view. But it's not just in modern philosophy. If you look, go and look at contemporary philosophy from the early 1900s, you see people grappling with these same issues, and they end up arriving at the same views. So the logical positivists and the phenomenalists of that time, and if you know anything about that, they end up saying the same stuff. So this is an issue we've got to deal with. And there are three basic problems or arguments here. So one, the argument from illusion. Second is hallucinations. And the third is perceptual science. So let's look at them briefly in turn. So starting with the argument from an illusion, on the right-hand side of your screen, there's an actual illusion there. So it looks like there is a triangle, which is outlined in black, and that on top of it is a white triangle outlined in white. So do you see that white triangle over there? I'm pretty sure you do. This is a very strong illusion. But really, all that there are those three Pac-Man shapes. And the way that the Pac-Man shapes are arranged produces an illusion as of a second triangle on top of the first triangle. So really all there is like some line segments in these Pac-Man shapes, and somehow the rest is, where is it? But notice that we said we perceive the triangle. But there is no triangle out there to perceive. There's no property that we're sensing. It's not there. It's an illusion. The paper, the thing that's on the screen isn't the way that it appears to you. So what do you say about that? It seems like there's something there. It appears to you as though there's this white triangle. There's nothing physical which we can say appears that way. So it looks like this has got to be something like your visual experience presenting to you something which appears this way, which now looks like, aha, you have something which is not the thing itself, but the visual experience, which presents the world as being a certain way, even when it isn't, because the world is slightly different than the way it is when it's presented. The world is slightly different than the way it actually is when you're looking at an illusion. Now, related to this, but different, is the argument from hallucination. So an illusion is where there is an object there, it's just that you perceive it to be different than it really is. A hallucination is when there is no object there and you just have the perception. So when there's an illusion, you see something in a way that it's really not. And when you hallucinate, there's nothing there that you're seeing. You're just having an experience as of seeing or whatever. Now, many people have thought that, excuse me, many people have thought that when you have a hallucination, when you hallucinate something, I tell this story all the time, but when I was in college, I had lived in the dorms briefly, and there was one of these kids in the dorms who took a lot of drugs, and he was running down the hallways in his underwear, screaming about Snuffleupagus, claiming to be chasing this hairy mammoth down the hallway and into the bathroom. Now, of course, it was just a college kid in his underwear running down the hallway. There was no Snuffleupagus there. But if you've ever had a hallucination, they seem convincing from the point of view of the hallucinator. From that person's point of view, it really appeared to him as though there were a Snuffleupagus running down the hallway. Now, dreams are not hallucinations, but they seem related to hallucinations in that you have a kind of perceptual experience in the absence of anything that is outside of you that you're perceiving. So when you dream about a red apple, the red in the dream looks just like the red when you're awake. The hallucinated object looks just like the physical object. You can't tell the difference. Now, of course, you can. If you try to grab it, you won't feel it, and you'll realize maybe it's an hallucination. But the point is that there are at least some cases of hallucinations which are completely and totally indistinguishable from the same occurrent event actually being perceived. The reason that that's a problem for the direct realist view is that there is no physical object there which plausibly counts as the thing which you're perceiving. So you might say, you see, well, the illusion case, that's different. There's actually a thing there. It's just that, you're misrepresenting it. You're misattributing a property to it. But here in the hallucination case, there's no thing, right? When you're dreaming, there's no object that you're pointing at. If you were to point at a red apple and say that apple looks delicious, it's a dream apple. There's no, you're having the experience as of pointing at the thing which you're experiencing as of being an apple, but that's all at the level of a mental thing. There's no physical thing there. Now, you either have to say one of two things. Either you're always aware of mental objects only because the dream Lamborghini looks just like the real Lamborghini. So if they're the same, I assume you don't have a Lamborghini in your dream. So you either have to say, well, they're the same all the time, or you have to say, well, look, there's a difference here. That when you actually see the Lamborghini, you're right there with the object. But in the other case, there's this other thing there, an experience or mental thing. That's called disjunctivism, in case anyone cares. The problem with this view is that it's hard to say how it is that from your point of view, the two things are indistinguishable and yet different. So the red in the dream and the red seen while awake, completely indistinguishable. So how could they be different? Now, some people will challenge the idea that they are really completely indistinguishable. And of course, that's something that we can have a debate. Is there anything dreamy about dream red? Is there anything in the dream which would clue you into the fact that it's a dream red versus a real red? Well, the movie Inception seems to present us a case where that doesn't happen. I mean, if you're careful, the person in the dream never notices that it's a dream. Does that really happen? These are interesting questions. Now, I'm not telling you the answers to these questions, but I am suggesting that many people have thought that this pushes you away from direct realism and towards a view of mental representation, where there is a thing which has a content. The content is the way it presents the world to you. All right, and then finally, if you don't like dreams and hallucinations and illusions, we can consider the argument from perceptual science. So our current investigations into the actual physical basis of perception and sensation have led us to the brain. And you might think that's obvious, but of course, Aristotle thought that the heart was where where a perception took place, and that the sense organs fed into the heart somehow, and the brain didn't play a real role for him. And of course, he was drastically wrong about that. But we know the brain is importantly involved, and that's good news and bad news because it gives us a way to account for how perception might proceed, that it proceeds by the activity of these brain areas. But on the other hand, we've also discovered that, the brain areas are the only thing that are required in order to have the relevant kinds of perceptions or experiences. So if you just stick an electrode into someone's brain and stimulate it, turn on the electricity, they'll have an experience. Right? You zap them and they go, I taste chocolate. You zap them and they hear a sound. You zap them and they remember their mother's voice. So it seems in principle that you could have all of the attributes of waking experience just by directly stimulating the brain. And of course, that's the kind of case we have in Dream. And of course, that's the premise of the movie The Matrix. If all you need is the correct brain stimulations, then you can just bypass the physical world and the way the sense organs are connected to it and stimulate the brain directly, and you generate all of the same experiences: colors, shapes, sounds, tastes. So how then is it that we can claim that in experience we're directly and immediately in contact with a physical world if we know that you could put a person in a lab and stimulate the brain the right way? In fact, it seems like we could stick a person's brain into a vat and stimulate that in the right way and get all the right experiences. Doesn't that show us that we are, in a sense, brains in the vat being our skull? Well, some people think yes. Now you might say, well, look, what about pain and so forth? Don't you need a body for that, right? You have the pain. I see the color. Well, here is where people will often appeal to phenomenon like phantom limb pain. And this is something that Descartes did, in fact, appeal to in the Meditations and other places. This is something that Descartes did, in fact, appeal to in his own writing. So phantom limb pain is a very real phenomenon whereby there are people who are missing limbs, but who nonetheless say sincerely, and we believe trustworthily, they say they're in pain in the limb which is missing. So we have a case of a person who's missing their arm, but yet who claims that the arm hurts. They may say, it's right here in between my second and third knuckle. I feel an intense pain. But of course, there is no knuckle. The arm's gone, amputated. Now, what are we supposed to make of this kind of case? Well, many people will claim that what we make of it is that what a pain really is a mental thing, not a physical thing. If you can have the experience of pain and experience it as being located on your arm, when in fact your arm has been amputated, then that suggests that the experience of pain is not actually located in the arm, but rather that you are perceiving something mental, the pain, and that pain represents itself as being located on a particular bodily part. And this kind of argument, which I've just been discussing, has led many people to think that perception is intentional in the way that thoughts are, or at least to some degree, it's more like that than not. And the reason that is because of these kinds of cases. When I perceive something, I represent the world as being a certain way, as having red out there. Now, if these kinds of dream cases and so forth are correct, then what's really going on is when you are perceiving red, you are in a mental state which represents the world as being a certain way, so that you are not in direct contact with the object in a way that doesn't involve a representation, but there always is some mental thing, some purely mental thing that goes beyond the properties which you are perceiving in the act of perception. And that act has content, and those contents are involved with the way the world would have to be in order to make your perception accurate. So when you're perceiving red, you represent the world as being a certain way. And if your perception is accurate, then red is out there. It's represented in the it's the world is the way it is represented when you have a correct or accurate perception. And when you hallucinate red, when you're dreaming about red, your perception doesn't represent the world accurately. So that's what we would call a perception which was inaccurate. And once you have this notion in hand, the notion of accuracy or inaccuracy, which is tied to the notion of a content, tied to the notion of representation, of presenting the world in a certain way, then you have intentionality. Then you have directedness, something standing for something else. So in experience, we seem to be directed to the world, so that even, now appreciate this point, even if you are hallucinating, the experience of red that you're having is presented as being outside of your mind. Even in the hallucination, even in the dream. That's why it's often the case that you don't realize you're dreaming when you are, or that you're hallucinating when you are. And that's because the experience that you're having is presented to you not as though it's going on in your own mind, but as though it's coming from outside. That's intentionality. That's directedness. That's representation. That's aboutness. One way of putting this is it's almost like the senses are telling you, and that perception is receiving the information. There's red out there. It's not like having a sentence, or we'll wonder later in the next section whether it's like having a sentence, but it's like having something which can be assessed for accuracy, red out there, and then we can look at the situation and say, yes, they're right, there is red out there, or we can say they're wrong. No, there isn't red out there. So in some sense or other, now you may disagree, and I'm happy to entertain this discussion, but the claim is that in some sense or other, the best way to make sense of all of these things that we've been talking about is to attribute intentionality to perception, to attribute contents to perception, and to attribute accuracy conditions to perception. Now, the next question, which we'll talk about next week again, is where's consciousness here? Because all of these seem like paradigm examples of conscious experience. And also, how are concepts related to all this stuff? Are sensations non-conceptual? Are perceptions conceptual? Are perceptuals more thought-like? Are they less thought-like? There's what role does thought play in all of this stuff? So now that we've got our two kind of categories, thought and perception, now we can say, aha, where do these stand in relation to our prize trophy here, consciousness? And I look forward to having that discussion next week. Thank you.